Moment I saw my brother leaning over my aunt's shoulder at my engagement dinner, whispering something that made her set down her wine glass and stare at me, I knew he had been working on this for a long time. My brother, Owen, is 4 years older than me, which means he spent 4 extra years learning how to make our family see things his way. He's charming in the way that certain men are charming. The kind where you don't realize you've agreed to something until you're already 2 steps into doing it. Our parents always called him driven. I called him relentless, but I kept that to myself. I'm a registered nurse. I work long shifts at a hospital in Winnipeg. I drive a 10-year-old Civic, and I rent a 2-bedroom apartment that I split with my cat, Biscuit, until my fiancé, Elliot, moved in last spring. I am not the kind of person anyone would describe as calculating. Owen, on the other hand, had built a career in commercial real estate, wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent, and had spent the last several years quietly positioning himself as the responsible one in the family, the one who understood money, the one who should be trusted with difficult decisions. So when our grandmother passed away in March, and her lawyer read out her will, and it turned out she had left her Steinbach property, 22 acres outside the city, plus the old farmhouse she'd owned for 40 years, to me, Owen didn't just object. He constructed a campaign. I need to give you some context about my grandmother because she matters to this story more than anyone else in it. She was 81 years old, sharp until the last year of her life, and she had opinions about everything from federal politics to the correct way to make pierogies. She also had opinions about Owen. She loved him. She also saw him. There's a difference, and my grandmother understood it better than most people I've ever met. About 8 months before she died, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon, not a holiday, not a birthday, just a regular Tuesday, and asked if I could come out to the property that weekend. I took Friday off and drove the 2 hours. We sat on her porch and she told me that she'd been thinking about what would happen to the land. She said Owen had been asking her about it for years. She said every time he visited, the conversation found its way there, and she was tired of it. She told me she wanted me to have it. I told her I didn't need her to do that. She said, "I know you don't need it. That's exactly why you're getting it." We spent the rest of that weekend canning tomatoes and watching old hockey games on her ancient television. I drove home Sunday night with 2 jars of preserves on the passenger seat and no idea that Owen was already monitoring her bank statements. He would deny that, of course. But I know what I found out later, and I'll get to it. When the will was read, Owen sat very still and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and pleasantly, that he thought there might have been some undue influence involved. He said our grandmother had been unwell. He said he had concerns. He used the word concerns 4 times in about 90 seconds. Our aunt started crying. Our cousin Brent, who always does whatever Owen tells him to do, nodded along like a bobblehead. Our parents looked at me like I had done something I needed to explain. I want to be clear. My grandmother was assessed by her physician twice in the 14 months before she died. She had mild hearing loss and a bad knee. Cognitively, she was completely intact. This is in her medical records. Her lawyer had also noted in writing that she had been fully informed of all decisions and had expressed her wishes without any prompting. None of that stopped Owen. Within 3 weeks of the will reading, I found out through my cousin, not Brent, my cousin Heather, who actually likes me, that Owen had hired a private investigator. He told the family he was doing it to protect Grandma's legacy. What he was actually doing was building a case to contest the will and have the property transferred to a trust he would control. The investigator was supposed to find evidence that I had manipulated our grandmother. Phone records, photographs, witnesses who might say I'd visited too often or not often enough, or that something about my behavior during her final months was suspicious. I found this out on a Thursday night. Elliot was working late. I sat in our kitchen with Biscuit on my lap, and I thought about my grandmother on her porch, asking me if I wanted more tea, telling me I worked too hard and needed to sleep more. I thought about the will and the pierogies and the 2 jars of tomatoes still sitting on my counter, and then I stopped feeling sorry for myself and I started making notes. The first thing I did was call my own lawyer. Her name is Sandra. She's been practicing estate law in Manitoba for 23 years. And she did not panic when I explained the situation. She told me that contesting a will on grounds of undue influence requires actual evidence, and that my grandmother's documented medical history would make that case very difficult for Owen to win. She also told me to start keeping records of everything, every conversation, every message, every interaction with family members. So I did. While I was doing that, I started noticing things that hadn't clicked into place before. My grandmother had mentioned, in passing, a few months before she died, that she was confused about some withdrawals from her checking account. She thought she'd misremembered making some transfers. She'd asked Owen to take a look because he understood that kind of thing. She mentioned it once and then didn't bring it up again, and I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I thought about it now. I called Heather again. She had power of attorney documents she'd helped my grandmother organize 2 years prior, and copies of some account statements she'd been holding on to. When I asked her if I could look at them, she went quiet for a second, and then she said, "I've been wondering when someone was going to ask me that." We met for coffee the following Saturday. She brought a folder. Over the previous 26 months, which is to say the period after our grandmother's health had started declining and Owen had taken over, helping her manage her finances, there were a series of transfers out of my grandmother's personal savings account into a holding account Owen had set up, ostensibly for property maintenance costs. The transfers were modest enough to avoid triggering any automatic flags. $1,200 here, $800 there, occasionally $2,000 at once. Over 26 months, it added up to just over $38,000. There were maintenance receipts. Owen had been meticulous about that. But Heather and I went through them together, and several of the companies listed didn't have verifiable business registrations in Manitoba. One of them had a contact address that turned out to be a postal box in a UPS store on Portage Avenue. I sat with this for a week before I told Sandra. Sandra sat with it for 2 days. Then she told me that what I was looking at potentially constituted financial elder abuse under the Criminal Code of Canada, and that she was obligated to advise me to report it. She also told me this would change the nature of any will contest Owen tried to mount, because a person who has been financially exploiting a deceased individual typically does not have standing to claim they were acting in that individual's best interests. I reported it to the RCMP the following Tuesday. The investigator assigned to the file was professional and thorough. She asked me detailed questions, took all of Heather's documents, and told me they would be in touch. She also told me not to discuss the investigation with family members, which meant the next several weeks were some of the more uncomfortable of my life. Owen, during this period, was escalating. He had told our aunt that I had been visiting our grandmother multiple times a week in her final months specifically to soften her up. He told our parents that he had testimony from a neighbor who had seen my car at the property constantly. He emailed me twice, Sick and our cousin Brent and our aunt, asking if I would agree to mediation. The emails were polite and carefully worded and made me sound like the unreasonable party for not responding immediately. I forwarded all of it to Sandra. She told me not to respond directly and drafted a single reply on my behalf that said I was receiving the correspondence and would be in touch through counsel. Owen did not like that. He called our mother and told her I was being aggressive and lawyering up unnecessarily and that this was going to tear the family apart. Our mother, who genuinely loves both of us and was completely in the dark about the financial situation, called me in tears. That was one of the harder phone calls I've had. I told her that I loved her and that everything was going to be okay and that I couldn't explain everything yet. But I needed her to trust me for a little while longer. She said okay. She asked if I was eating. I told her I was eating. She didn't fully believe me. In the meantime, my engagement dinner. Yes, Elliot and I were planning a wedding through all of this, which in retrospect was either brave or completely unhinged, arrived on a Saturday in October. It was held at Elliot's parents' house in St. Vidal, about 30 people. Nice evening, low-key, nothing fancy. Owen came. Of course he came. He was pleasant all night, the version of himself that everyone who hasn't dealt with him the wrong way finds easy to like. He made a toast. He hugged me. He told Elliot he was happy to have him in the family. He leaned over and whispered something to our aunt, and she looked at me and I smiled at her and went to get more sparkling water. Elliot caught up with me in the kitchen. He'd seen it too. He's performing, Elliot said. He always is, I said. How are you doing? I'm waiting for the RCMP to finish their investigation and trying not to think about it every minute of every day. How's that going? Not great. He handed me a glass of water and we stood there for a minute. And then we went back out and I talked to Elliot's mom about her garden and tried to have a nice time at my own engagement party. 6 weeks later, the RCMP concluded their preliminary investigation and laid charges. Owen was charged under Section 331 of the Criminal Code, theft by a person holding power of attorney. The charge related to the $38,000 in transfers. There was also a secondary charge related to the falsification of business records because some of those maintenance receipts turned out to have been created by Owen himself using a company name he'd registered and then dissolved. He found out about the charges on a Monday morning. He called me that afternoon. I didn't answer. He called our mother. He told her it was a misunderstanding. He told her I had gone after him out of spite over the will. He used the word vindictive. He called Heather a traitor. Heather called me after and said simply, worth it. The will contest that Owen had filed was effectively frozen pending the criminal proceedings. Sandra explained that this is fairly standard. Courts are reluctant to proceed with civil estate disputes when the same underlying facts are the subject of an active criminal file. The property was not going anywhere. Our aunt, once she understood what the charges actually involved, stopped talking to Owen for the better part of 2 months. She called me in November and we had a long conversation I hadn't been expecting. She told me that she had been worried about the finances for a while, but hadn't said anything because she thought she was misunderstanding something. I told her she hadn't been misunderstanding anything. Our parents were the harder conversation. My mother processed it in stages: shock, then grief, then a kind of quiet anger that I think came from realizing she'd been used to put pressure on me during a period when Owen already knew what was coming. My father was quieter about it. He told me once that he was proud of me, and then he didn't bring it up again, which is exactly how my father handles things that are too big for him. Owen's criminal proceedings are still ongoing. His lawyer has entered a not guilty plea, and the case is scheduled for a pretrial hearing. Sandra says the documentation is strong and the Crown has the records. I'm not going to speculate on the outcome because I've learned, the hard way, to let things move at the pace they move. What I know is this: the Steinbach property is still in my name. Last May, Elliot and I drove out there for the first time since my grandmother died. We walked the perimeter of the property in the early evening when the light goes flat and golden and the fields smell like something you can't quite name. Elliot held my hand. There's an old fenced line along the east edge that needs replacing, and the farmhouse needs a new roof within the next couple of years. None of that is cheap, and we don't know yet what we're going to do with the land long term. But standing there, I thought about my grandmother saying that she wanted me to have it not because I needed it, but because she knew I wouldn't do the wrong thing with it. I think she knew even then that someone was going to try to take it. I think she knew it wouldn't work. I keep thinking about the drive back from Steinbach last May, the way the fields looked in that late daylight, flat and gold, and how quiet it was with just Elliot beside me and the windows cracked. It didn't feel like winning. It felt more like exhaling after holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten you were doing it. I've turned this whole thing over in my head more times than I can count. Not to relitigate it, but because I genuinely want to understand how it unfolded the way it did. Owen is smart. He is organized and careful, and he had been building his version of events for years before I ever knew there was a version to contest. And yet here we are. What I keep coming back to is something my grandmother said to me once. Not about Owen, not about the property, just in passing, the way she said most of the things that mattered. She said the difference between people who do right and people who don't usually isn't intelligence. It's whether they've decided, somewhere underneath everything, that the rules apply to them. Owen had decided they didn't. That decision made him careless in ways he couldn't see. Because when you believe you're exempt, you stop checking your own work. I didn't do anything heroic here. I want to be honest about that. I hired a lawyer, I kept records, I answered questions carefully, and I let the process move at its own pace even when it felt unbearable. That's not courage in any dramatic sense. But I think there's something to be said for just not giving up, for staying in the room when someone is doing everything they can to make you feel like you don't belong there. Heather stayed in the room too. She'd been sitting on those documents for months, unsure if she was misreading things, unsure if saying something would make her the difficult one. When I asked her directly, she didn't hesitate. I think about that a lot. How much gets covered up simply because the person who knows is waiting for someone to ask? There's a version of this story where I don't call Sandra, where I feel too overwhelmed or too outnumbered and I let Owen's narrative take hold because fighting it seems like more than I can manage. I understand that version. I lived close to it for about a week after I found out about the investigator. The thing that pulled me back wasn't anger, though there was plenty of that. It was something steadier, a kind of refusal to let my grandmother's clear-eyed decision about her own property get rewritten by someone who'd spent years treating her as an asset to be managed. She knew what she was doing when she chose me. She knew what she was doing when she called me on a Tuesday afternoon with no occasion and asked me to come out to the porch. I think she was trying to tell me something then that I'm only now fully understanding. That integrity isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do with a folder full of bank statements on a Saturday morning when nobody's asking you to look. Owen's case is still moving through the courts. I don't know how it ends. But the land is mine. The roof needs replacing. And somewhere in my kitchen there are 2 jars of tomatoes. My grandmother and I canned together that I have never been able to bring myself to open. I think I'll open them this summer.